Hey everyone, thanks for joining this panel session around driving effective data and marketing team collaboration. My name is Matt Lewis. I'm from RudderStack on the partnerships function. I'm joined by Monika Vo from Lucent as the head of marketing, Matt Mitchell, a data and engineering leader, and Elizabeth Press, who's the founder of D3M Labs, which is a data blog and community. We're going to talk a little bit about some collaboration that we've seen across data and marketing teams as it relates to working with customer data platforms and some of the common challenges that those teams face. But I'll pass it over to Elizabeth, who will kind of moderate the session for us today.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Matt Lewis and RudderStack for having me here. So, CDPs, customer data platforms, are a huge opportunity for any data-driven growth in any scale-up, startup, or even mature companies. But it's always been this: who owns it? Is it the marketing team? Is it data? And sometimes it's some other team. So this is why we have gotten here together to really discuss what we could do with CDP and who should own it and how we could all work together. So who should own the CDP? I'll just, throw that out. Matt Mitchell, maybe you could start. Should it be the data team or the marketing team? What do you think?
Well, I think for me, it should always be the data team, but there's some kind of catches and limits on that. So the data team often aren't that close to the business. They don't really understand what the marketing team need. So I think it's essential to get the input from marketing about what do they want. So yeah, ideal world, the data team would be owning it. But I think in practice, when you start out, it's the marketing people. It's easy to build the stack yourself now. There's great tools out there. So I think you start small, you grow, and then you start hitting pain points. And at the time you hit those pain points, that's when everyone's saying to a central data team, hey folks, we need some help here. How can you make this work? So maybe I'd say it depends on the maturity.
Monika, what do you think?
Yeah, I will have to agree with that. I do think that at the end of the day, the data team should own it. And marketing basically acts as their client. So they are, of course, a huge stakeholder of the CDP. But the data team is much better at working with it, making sure that there's no duplication, that the data is clean. So ensuring that all teams work with the same data set. So yeah, data team it is.
Okay, so I'm going to play a devil's advocate, because I do think there should be at least a little bit of this of discourse on this disagreement. So there's the data mesh out there, and there's been a lot of talk in the data community about the data mesh, and the data product should be closer to the action, wherever that might be for the CDP, perhaps with the performance marketers. What do you think? Is there any merit to that?
All right, I think I have to revise my stance here then. So I still believe that the data team should own it, but there should be a dedicated kind of like a business partner within the data team that works very closely with the marketing team. I think that way we can ensure that someone who also knows about the marketing and all of the business related stuff that is on the side of the customer, like that can work with the customer data platform much better. They are much closer to the action. They will be communicating with the marketing much closer. So maybe a dedicated person within the data team would solve this problem. So I do think data mesh as a concept is a very good idea and a very good thing for companies to implement.
Okay. But so when we get to the actual, let's say, work and doing things like building customer profiles, building segments, who should be involved in that, actually?
Yeah, I can take that one. So I think when you're building those customer profiles, oftentimes it's the teams that are doing segmentation and analysis based on that customer data. So I think historically that has lived either in sort of the CDP's data silo, which would be on their own servers somewhere that's not in that company's kind of purview of their own data warehouse, or it's happening by the marketing team in a downstream tool like an ESP or an advertising tool for targeting purposes. I think when you look at constructing those customer profiles, and the companies that we've seen at RudderStack want to take more ownership of those customer profiles, they now want to build those data profiles in-house, in systems that they control, in the data warehouse, where it's closer to production data, closer to other inputs that they're evaluating. And so what we've seen is customer segmentation and owning customer profiles has actually moved to in-house tools that companies own, creating those customer profiles in the data warehouse and federating copies of that audience to those downstream tools for activation.
So then I have a question, because often the criteria is a big issue, how you actually use these customer profiles and the customer segments in campaigns, for example. Who should do that? Because in my experience as a data leader, I've seen that the marketing team has a lot of customer knowledge, and they're the ones who are in the trenches actually talking with the customers, looking to see what works, what doesn't, and whatnot. And there are actually quite a few marketing people who do know about math and statistics, despite maybe some stereotypes. I found a lot of very savvy marketers out there, especially in the digital world. On the data side of things, you have also a lot of very smart people who are technically savvy. A lot of data people do know statistics. It is, mathematics is the core of data analysis. They code a lot, and even with the low code tools, still there is the statistical analysis that's very important. But I feel like sometimes there's a lack of business knowledge in the data team, and this is where it's very difficult to bring that context and that really important business savvy knowledge into actually building those profiles and using those profiles, and on the other hand, understanding the exact context of the company and executing them very well. What is your experience, Matt, Mitchell, and Monika?
And I think this is a problem that comes up quite a lot, and it's been going for years on and off, really. And essentially, you have the situation where a given business unit, say marketing, saying, we need this. The data people don't understand the business context here. They don't get why we want this, what we want to do with it. And the data people aren't understanding it. And I think there's two ways you can go from there. So one way you'll see is where people say, okay, we'll give it to the marketing people because they understand what's needed, they understand why it matters. Or you can say, actually, we need to educate the data people. We need to work together with them as well and make sure they understand why it's important. And for me, I've got this big feeling that data should always be seen as a product. And if you start bringing in product management as a discipline, much as it's used in software engineering, you can start using business value to drive the decisions. So you're not saying, what should we make? Let's see if it works. You're saying, what can we make for marketing? What's going to give them the most value? What's most important? What can they leverage? And I think maybe the secret is don't accept this kind of situation where you say, we've got a group of people that don't understand the business. They're part of the business. You just need to find a way to bring them in and make sure they do understand what's needed and why it matters. Because also, if you're doing something that's not useful to the business, why is that?
Yeah, I 100% agree with Matt Mitchell on this. Like as Matt said, the data team needs to understand the business and how their work impacts the company and their growth. And I also think it helps with their own positioning and standing within the company, right? Because a lot of times, if there's an economic downturn, unfortunately, data teams or data team members get laid off. But if they can actually prove their impact on the business itself, then they're really like no sane leader would let you go, I believe. I think also with the data team, they might be able to spot trends or patterns in the data sets that the marketing team might not be able to stumble upon. So leveraging their skills here can be very beneficial. But at the same time, marketing should also be giving like business input and pointers so the data team can then help with the segmentation process. So, I mean, at the end of the day, it really is a collaboration effort. Both should be doing the segments. I do think that marketing should be owning it at the end of the day, just because they also need to design the campaigns that targets these segments. But I mean, in my ideal world, I would love to work with the data team on segmentation and not just by myself.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, Monika, around the segmentation and data collection. So, having that collaboration from the marketing team setting business objectives and goals for how they're trying to segment customers and how that affects the targeting and the advertising and marketing spend that they're deploying downstream. That's only effective if you're able to, one, collect the right data points from that customer's behavior on web and on mobile apps on the properties that they're interacting with. And then two, combine that data with other valuable sources of information to kind of build that complete customer profile. And I think with that information and with that specific segmentation where the marketing team is collaborating with the data team to help set that, the advertising and marketing spend can be far more effective.
And what can the different teams do to win trust with each other? Because often this collaboration comes from maybe a miscommunication or, under people with two different skill sets, sometimes clashing, sometimes having different priorities. What have you seen working?
I think that was a really important keyword that you just threw out there, miscommunication. I think it really is all about communication. So speaking from my experience, what really helped was just sitting at the table with the data team, talking things through, talking about their priorities, trying to understand what they have on that table, trying to make them understand why maybe my requests are more or less important, whatever it is. And then trying to come up with a plan and just prioritization. So it's really just about communicating with them properly, because I think there's a huge lack of communication, not just between data teams and marketing teams, just between all teams in a lot of startups, companies that I've also worked with. So just figuring that one out is already super beneficial.
Yeah, I think I'd agree 100% on that. It's all in communication and transparency. If people could understand why something matters, then they can see the value of doing it. If people could understand what's needed to deliver something, then they can understand how long it takes. And I think a lot of the time people don't communicate those things because they're too busy or they don't understand, or even sometimes people just don't ask. So yeah, sit down and talk.
Maybe adding on to that, I also think we all kind of live in our own bubble, even within companies, within our respective fields. We all think that other teams or colleagues might know why something is important to us, why it should be prioritized, but in reality, they just don't know because they don't have all of the context that we have. So really being transparent about that, explaining why it is so important, and also the impact it has and their work will have on the company, on the business itself, makes it much easier to collaborate.
And then going to your point of everyone living in their own bubble and their own reality, I found that the value of time and urgency is a big point of sometimes friction between marketing and data team. And what I mean by that is specifically, often I've seen performance marketing wanting things really quickly, living in the moment. For me as a data leader, living in the moment, where the data team says, whoa, wait a minute, this takes time. There's this big queue of stuff. And that seems to be, I think, the root cause of a lot of this friction. How have you seen that managed well?
It often isn't, I think, to be honest. It's a difficult one to answer, and I think one of the problems that you'll face in a lot of businesses is that it's hard to see the value of data teams, especially when people can't demonstrate the ROI. But at the same time, if you're looking at a difference in your marketing spend of $500,000, then that does make a solid business case saying we need another engineer or two here, or at least one anyway. And I think that's one thing that people find hard to work with. So if you've got limited resources, there's always going to be a limit on what gets done. And I think communication is good, transparency is good about what's there, and also how long things will take is useful, because everyone wants everything yesterday, but the next best thing to getting it yesterday is at least knowing when you will get it. And I think if you can get to a point where you can plan ahead and give those kind of answers to people, that goes at least some of the way towards making things work. Or saying, what you've asked for, that's going to take 3 weeks, but we could do something quick tomorrow. People will always take quick and almost good enough tomorrow over waiting 3 weeks. So I think, as Monika was saying again, if you're not in a bubble and you're talking about what you want and why in terms of outcomes rather than specifics, sometimes that can be a helpful way of doing it. But it's a difficult skill. It's not always something that comes instantly to data people. It's not something that comes instantly to anybody. I mean, finding people who've got that ability to break these things down is quite hard sometimes, I think.
I also believe it's a company-wide effort. So what I have witnessed is the data team is reporting, or the data leader is reporting to another C-level. So that also makes it very difficult for them to prioritize things, because if they get requests from their manager, of course they want to work on that, right? But then again, do we as a company, do we prioritize things that improve our ROI, or what is it that we as a company, what kind of strategy are we trying to follow and achieve? So I think that is a central question that the company as a whole needs to ask itself, and then helps all the team to really understand what they need to prioritize. Because I think it's very difficult for a data team to prioritize by themselves. I think that is also why there's so much friction coming up, because obviously me as a marketing leader, I believe all of my requests are highly important and always need to be tended to immediately. But then again, there might be other projects that I do not know about that might also be very important for the company strategy. But I just don't understand it because we don't talk about it. There's no transparency about it. So yeah, circling back again, it's really about transparency and communication, like Matt said.
Yeah, definitely. And also maybe having a business partner or some dedicated resource to work with marketing, so that maybe this temporal issue doesn't come up as much as it might otherwise. So let's go to the tracking plans, because I think that we could talk about business cases and how we could work together and all of these very important issues. But if your tracking doesn't work, then all of the other stuff is going to be of less value to the company anyway. So unfortunately, so tell me, how do you see the tracking plan being implemented, and who do you think should be working within the implementation? And what I mean by this is, what I've seen in some scale-ups, if I'm talking about Berlin, is maybe the tracking hasn't been done in a couple of years. It's old. It was for some people who used to be there, and this is something I've seen at quite a few companies. So it's nobody in particular, but when you want to overcome this sort of messiness with the tracking, what teams should be involved? Should it be marketing? Should it be data, maybe engineering, product? What have you seen work?
Yeah, excuse me. In terms of tracking plans, yeah, in terms of tracking plans, I think that's a great area to start with cross-functional collaboration with not just the data teams and the marketing teams, but even the engineering teams working closely to achieve this goal. So, what we've seen a lot of the times when customers come to RudderStack is, to your point, Elizabeth, they have these dated tracking plans where they were in a spreadsheet somewhere, they were managed by a single person. The events that they're tracking no longer match the ideal customer journey or the happy path that they're looking to push users down and track those activities. So oftentimes when they bring on a new CDP, customers take advantage of the opportunity to refresh their tracking plans. And I think best practices when updating these tracking plans is typically looks a lot like having collaboration from marketing teams' goals to say, here's what I'm trying to measure, here's what I'm trying to do with that data downstream, as well as having the engineering team then go and make that actual change to the production code base. So very often it involves not just a request from the marketing team to engineering, but that closer collaboration to work together in that same design.
So, okay, maybe me. Yeah, I think we had from my experience, I've worked with a similar setup to what Matt Lewis just said. In our case, so oftentimes when you're in like an early stage startup, it starts with the marketing team or the first marketeer, just because you don't have any data person just yet. But once you scale your business, I do think it's very important, really, to revise your whole tracking plan. And what worked really well for us was marketing team basically giving the input, just like Matt Lewis said, trying like explaining what it is that we want to achieve, what it is that we want to track, in collaboration with the data team, actually. So it was the data team that came up with the tracking infrastructure, also with a proper naming convention. And I think a lot of companies kind of, just do not care as much about naming convention as maybe I do, but it really makes it so much easier later on to work with the data if you have proper naming convention set in place once and for all. And then once you have revised like this whole tracking infrastructure and like discussed it within the data, between the data team and the marketing team, we then handed it over to front-end developers to then actually implement what we had in mind. So we had basically these 3 teams working on this joint project together.
Matt Mitchell, do you have?
Well, pretty much I just agree with everything that's gone before. And I think for me, it's something that should start between marketing and product, right? You need to capture the requirements, plan it out, definitely bring in engineering and data to plan out the naming and the structure and the way everything fits together and implement it from the front end. But it's always a tricky balancing act though as well, because one thing that you want to do is to be able to compare changes over time. And if you're changing your tracking plan every 2 months, apart from the fact that nobody really has the time to do this, but if you did, it's very hard to compare like for like. So it's hard to get a good balance. I think planning it out well in the first place so that you can use it for a while effectively is quite key to this. But definitely, it starts with marketing and product for me without any doubt.
And I think one thing that's very important is that it's a continuous effort. I think a lot of companies look at it as this like monolithic project. We're just going to update all of our tracking. And because it's so big, this never gets done. Partially because of what we were saying before, in performance marketing, they're looking at their campaigns and, you need to get revenue, and there's all of these other sorts of priorities that are coming up, and sometimes the same people who would be doing the tracking. So I think somehow resource planning in terms of that is very important. Okay, so what about, there's other issues that I think often come up in terms of CDPs and working well together. And I think one of the big hurdles that I've often seen in good collaboration is data consistency and data quality. As a data leader, you're always hearing from marketing, from product, from someone else, oh, this looks different than that in this dashboard, and why are those two numbers different? Or, the dashboard isn't working, or, something in an email looks off. And I feel like as a data leader, that should be a huge priority, and it's sometimes not because of execution, because of these day-to-day revenue driving tasks. And how have you managed this, or seen this handled well? I guess Matt Mitchell or Monika.
Well, I think for me, data quality is a tricky issue because the biggest problem is data quality is always bad, right? We're working with stuff from the real world and it never comes in quite the way you'd like it. There's always glitches, gaps, things are wrong, things are inconsistent, how we measure it changes. So the first thing is that you have to be able to adopt a bit of flexibility somewhere and say, we're going to accept that there are limitations on what we're doing. But if you can identify the variances and say, yeah, we expect this to be right to within, say, 0.5% or 1%, or this data is okay for this use case, but if you need to get accurate figures for X, Y, Z, that won't work. There are data quality frameworks which obviously help, but I think one of the biggest problems that I've seen is actually more about how people are consuming and pulling the data out of systems. And you often see this where the more you democratize the data, the more you can see problems if it's not done right. So you need to make sure that all the KPIs are consistent across the business. Using things like metric layers can be really helpful. Producing standardized KPIs, standardized dashboards can also be useful. But there's always this kind of thing you'll find, and you particularly see it with marketing teams because they're all really used to getting the data themselves and querying it themselves. And I've never met one marketing team ever in their life that hasn't compared an internal dashboard with their own one. It goes with the territory, right? So you just have to work out, how do we define this metric? How do we define this metric? And then, again, talk about it, collaborate, find out what you want to do and try and stick with it. It's really difficult though. It's a perennial problem, and I don't think there's an instant way of doing it without being really prescriptive and top down. And I think if you want to be in an agile organization, if you want to be able to change quickly, then centralizing everything isn't always the way to go. So for me, it's a question of saying, here's what we know for certain, here's the things that are different, and this is why they're different. And then that way you can tolerate it and work with it.
Yeah, very much agree with Matt Mitchell here. So what I've seen is that a lot of times of course, we marketeers, we do not always want to bother the data team. So we just try to pull the data by ourselves. But what would really help is really have like a common definition for all of the metrics that we're working with, to really ensure that we all work with the same context and the same idea with these data sets. For example, just a really simple example, are we talking about time-based values or cohort-based values? I think that was one of the most common issues that I have witnessed with quite a few companies. Because even if we talk about cohort-based values, the marketing team had a very different definition of what cohort are we talking about compared to the sales team. So all of the business teams somehow ended up having a very different data set, basically fighting each other for the number of qualified leads or whatever metrics it is that we were tracking. So really having this common set of definitions would help a lot. But as Matt also said, we're working with real world data, so we cannot expect it always to be perfect. There will always be some issues with data quality, but having one owner ensuring that data sets are as clean as possible, not having duplications. I think that is something that companies should tackle early on, because once you have like a bunch of dirty data in your, even if it's just your CRM, it takes months or even years to really clean that out. And I have witnessed it so often, that people just set up some kind of whatever data pipeline it is, and then not really taking care of whether it's clean or not, whether it's a duplicate or not. And then later on, it's just so much more work, and so much more to deal with to really get to a certain level of quality again.
Yeah, and I think I'd agree. And I think this is an area where central data teams can really help, because yeah, they can take responsibility and ownership for data quality. And as you say, yeah, marketing, sales, every department's got their own idea of what the cohort is. So you need some kind of central place to say, okay, here you go. We've got a clear answer now and everyone can work with it. But it's not easy. And I think that every time other teams are pulling out their own data, it's a sign that there's a pain point. They're doing it because they're not getting what they need. So as data professionals, it's our job to say, okay, so how do we address this need? How do we meet it so that we can make sure everyone's using the same data, working on the same page?
And Matt Lewis, this is one of RudderStack's strengths, right? This is something that could be really helped.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I would add to the data quality issue, very quickly following a decline in data quality is a decline in data trust. And if you lose trust in the data, all of the downstream dashboards and segmentation and functionality that you're working on, the business teams now no longer trust those reports and those metrics. And it's very hard that we've seen to have those data teams repair that trust, especially as that trust gets associated with different software tools, different SaaS tools that are actually doing the data collection. And so maybe a better approach to that would be, democratizing the data that is collected and having a very transparent approach from a SaaS perspective of how that data is being captured, any type of transformations that are being applied to that data set as it is sent to downstream tools, so that when that data is populating a dashboard or a given tool, you're able to audit the tracking of that data and the source of that data all the way back to the point of origin. And so that helps keep data quality and data trust high within the organization.
Okay, well, thank you. I think we've covered a lot, and I think a lot of us are now a lot more savvy in terms of data and marketing collaboration and how we could use CDPs better. So thank you very much, everyone. And thank you, everyone in the audience, for listening. And I hope that you've also gotten wiser over the course of this evening.
Definitely. Thanks, Elizabeth, for moderating as well, and appreciate the time. Take care, everyone.